So now I'm going to move on a bit to the user experience. How do people with disabilities actually use technologies, and what does that mean in terms of the information that you create? Well, currently, the way things usually work is that people buy a computer and they have to purchase some additional software we generally refer to as assistive technology. Sometimes it's also called adaptive technology. Basically what that means is that additional software is purchased that sits over the top of a computer operating system and tries to make things accessible for people with disabilities. The only downside to this is that quite often this software costs about $2,000. I don't know why $2,000, that just seems to be the magical $2,000. Everything is $2,000. And I'll give you some examples of that. Windows XP and Vista does come with a few things under the bonnet already, which is really helpful. Some of the examples here, you can change the icon and text color and size. You can actually have on-screen alerts instead of audio alerts. So if you're hearing impaired, you can actually have messages explain why your computer just went donk. You can also, if you have trouble holding down, say, an Alt key and pressing another key, you can actually press one then the other. There's a feature for that. You can have a virtual mouse on your keyboard instead of using an actual physical mouse if you have mobility impairment. There's also things like an on-screen keyboard, which means if you have a head-pointing device, you have the option to tap out virtually letters on the screen. There's also a magnifier that puts a little strip up the top and makes things bigger, and also Narrator, which is a text-to-speech program that will read things out to you. Some of the more popular types of assistive technology under Windows XP and Vista, JAWS is probably the most common screen reader, and Zoomtext is probably the most common screen magnifier, and I'll give you a little demo of that now. So with Zoomtext, basically what this program does, as you can see, is it makes everything a little bit bigger and lets me scroll around the screen. So it just basically allows, when I can't see something, if I wanted to see the start button a bit more, I can do that. You've probably never seen the start button quite as big as that one. And this software is really helpful in terms of, just quickly making things bigger to help out. But unfortunately, as I said, $2,000. Now, some of you may be thinking in the audience, well, I have a Mac, so Macs are always superior anyway, so I'm sure it has more accessibility features. You're right. Macs are indeed superior when it comes to accessibility out of the box. Macs have VoiceOver, and whilst Narrator on Windows XP or Vista gives you sort of basic voice functionality, VoiceOver is actually makes a Mac fully accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired, so VoiceOver is far more advanced. Likewise, the Zoomtext program I just showed you, on a Mac, you don't have to pay $2,000 for that. It's just built in. I actually heard a joke when they first released VoiceOver into the Mac operating system. So people said, once upon a time, I spent $2,000 for assistive technology. Now I spend $800 and get a free Mac Mini. So it's all a matter of perspective. Also, there's Braille display support, which is quite handy. If people read Braille, you can actually get a device that has little pop-up pins, so you can read Braille through the computer, and Macs support that too. The downside to a Mac, though, is that VoiceOver, whilst very good at getting around the operating system, unfortunately it doesn't work with the Office suite. And for developers here, that's because it's written in Carbon rather than Cocoa. Also, there's a few other little bits and pieces. Safari, for example, isn't very accessible, although some of that's been addressed in the latest release, Snow Leopard 10.6. So, what's coming up at the moment for people with disabilities? Well, the really exciting thing is that the days of $2,000 extra pieces of software are starting to draw to a close. And this is a great thing for people with disabilities. One of the big things is Windows 7, the new Microsoft operating system which will replace Vista, and I hear lots of IT people cheering. That's due on the 22nd of October. And the great thing about Windows 7 is that it includes, for probably the first time in 10 years, a number of new accessibility features. The first is that it has a full screen magnifier, so now I don't have to buy Zoomtext. It is actually now a program similar to that integrated into Windows 7, which is wonderful. It also has predictive text in its on-screen keyboard, so as you tap away virtually on letters, like a mobile phone, it'll start to try and guess the word you want to type. It speeds things up a lot. It also runs on Netbooks. Now, netbooks are these very small, ultra-portable laptops that you may have seen around the place, like the Asus E. The great thing about netbooks is that not only are they affordable hardware, but the graphics cards are fully compatible with a lot of this assistive technology. In the past, you used to have to buy a real high-end computer to run programs like JAWS and Zoomtext, and the great thing is that now you don't. And we start to see a pattern emerging now. In the not-too-distant future, rather than spend $4,000 on a computer that a person with a disability can use, buy $2,000 on the computer, $2,000 on the software, now for $500, we can now get something like Windows 7 that has some really good support for accessibility. The only weak point really of Windows 7 is again the voice software narrator, but now just in the past 2 years, open source options have popped up, which is terrific. We have a program called NVDA, which is free and an Australian initiative, and that actually works quite well in terms of reading things out from the internet. Also, we have a program called Web Anywhere, and the great thing about Web Anywhere is that although it doesn't read out a lot, you can use it on any platform from any computer, even if it's locked down in a public library. You just go to a particular website, and I'm happy to give you that address afterwards, and if we have time, I'll give you a demo. And basically, it just starts reading to you. So for the first time in the history of people who are blind or vision impaired, you can actually walk up to any computer and have voice access, which is a great thing. Also, there's touchscreen support coming out in the new netbooks, which means that people with mobility can easily tap the screen to get what they want, and 3G support. So now you can have an accessible computer, a cheap computer, and you can use it with the internet just about anywhere you go. And that is an exciting future to look forward to in just a few months. So that sort of covers a bit about the user perspective, and I'll give you some demos about how those technologies work shortly when we look at the ABC sites.